A sad tendency that has developed in the West is that of holders of power blaming their subordinates for failings of the group. When bodies like communities or nations fall short of a task that has to be achieved collectively, like that of environmental preservation, supposed leaders will often fall back on the position that the issue is in reality a sort of collective burden of personal responsibility and that people should, quote, do better, unquote. This is also exhibited in men blaming their women for domestic issues or in dominant social groups blaming subordinate groups for social decay. The latter is exemplified in America's former WASP establishment blaming Asians, blacks and Catholics for misgivings, and its current urban elites blaming the country's problems on the white rural population. In total, we have long cultivated a society that dishonors, disregards and abuses all types of feminine or earthly components at the hands of its superordinates. It is no wonder then that Western women do not desire to exhibit the feminine character and that Western men do not desire to be subordinated to one another. In a society where the smaller is seen by the larger as an equal instead of a matter of personal responsibility, the smaller will always be left abandoned, mistreated and overruled. A vase blamed for being broken by those who knocked it over. In my videos, using words like death and submission in regards to the earthly element, it is therefore of prime importance to me not to be understood as undervaluing or dismissing it, but rather that I am chiefly interested in presenting it as it is. Pure, delicate, and blameless it is like the salt of the earth. The phrase, salt of the earth, is a reference to Matthew 5:13-16. The exegesis on this passage are plentiful, but one that sums it up best in my opinion is one that was given by Pope Francis during the Angelus on the 9th of February 2014. To better understand these images, we must keep in mind that Jewish law prescribed that a little bit of salt be sprinkled over every offering presented to God, as a sign of the covenant. Light for Israel was a symbol of messianic revelation, triumph over the darkness of paganism. Christians, the new Israel, receive a mission to carry into the world for all men. Through faith and charity they can guide, consecrate and make humanity fruitful. We who are baptized Christians are missionary disciples and we are called to become a living gospel in the world. With a holy life we will flavor different environments and defend them from decay, as salt does, and we will carry the light of Christ through the witness of genuine charity. But if we Christians lose this favor and do not live as salt and light, we lose our effectiveness. This mission of giving light to the world is so beautiful. We have this mission and it is beautiful. It is also beautiful to keep the light we have received from Jesus, protecting it and safeguarding it. The Christian should be a luminous person, one who brings light, one who always gives of light. A light that is not his, but a gift from God, a gift from Jesus. We carry this light. If a Christian extinguishes this light, his life has no meaning. He is a Christian by name only, who does not carry the light. His life has no meaning. I would like to ask you, how do you want to live? As a lamp that is burning or one that is not? Burning or not, how would you like to live? As burning lamps. It is truly God who gives us this light and we must give it to others. Shining lamps, that is the Christian vocation. The exegesis builds on the three uses of salt in the ancient world: flavoring, preserving, and purifying. It shows how these commandments of Christ prefigured the dissemination of Christianity through Rome. Although destined to triumph over the hostile Roman state, Christians did not seek to usurp it. Instead, they became like salt of the earth, living decades of martyrdom in such strong virtue that even the Roman critics of Christianity had a hard time arguing against Christian conduct. In this, Christianity took on the earthly role, enduring the beatings of the Master, only to repay them with a kiss and genuine pity for his decrepit state as they rose above him. The flavoring aspect of the earthly element can also be seen in how a good wife and children can bring flavor to a man's life, how music, which appeals to the sentiment rather than the intellect, can make otherwise monotonous tasks more enjoyable, or how it is the members that give the team its character. In Preserving, we see how the earthly element encapsulates the heavenly, like a vase that keeps water, or a lamp that keeps fire, how Mary keeps Christ perpetually in her midst as the Mother of God, or Theotokos, or how a medieval wife was expected to preserve her husband's estate if he was away or dead. This also plays out politically, where societies that were under female rule, like Victorian England, Russia under Catherine the Great, or Sparta, in which widows would regularly become wealthy and influential landowners, tend to become hyper-conservative, preserving the status quo. It is also the case here that if a woman ceases to preserve something good and animating within her, she shrivels together much more than a man would do in the same situation, whilst preserving so greatly enhances her beauty and radiance. In salt's use as a purifier, we see another key aspect of the earthly element. By itself it is pure, being completely passive it cannot be by itself well ordered, but also not be by itself disordered. This is how the earthly element, as a passive element, is also fully blameless, because purposive action is not in its nature. It is for this reason that in older societies, women were often much harder to accuse or even unable to be properly prosecuted in any type of judicial setting, being seen rather as subject to the judgment of their husbands, fathers, or other caretakers, who would also bear the burden for the woman's wrongdoings. Today, part of this still exists in law regarding children and parents. And this is also the reason why it is unbecoming for men to blame lower things such as their environment, or their genetics, or even their wives for their own failings. Instead, all disorder exists in heavenly elements. As such, it was the angels, not the animals, that rebelled against God. In recent history, the 60s generation tried to break open the brain in a new wave of experimental spirituality, often under the use of drugs, which wound up ultimately disordering those who partook in this movement and breaking up the fabric of Western society by dissolving societal order. Furthermore, it is demons, angelic beings, that were presented as inherently disordered in medieval art, and just like they exhibit an ability to possess people, other disordered things have an ability to possess the minds of man. This is the allure of puzzles and the tendency of, especially men, to engage in conspiracy theories, which grow out of the person observing obvious contradictions in the public narrative, which are then tried to be resolved by subjugating them into a grand narrative that is able to encapsulate them all. And here again, the 60s, as the birthplace of the modern conspiracy theorist, are a good example. I will mention two additional attributes of salt: its use as one of the first currencies known to man, and its typical form of being a collection of grains. Salt as currency mystically relates to its flavoring ability, and together with it signifies the correspondent delightability of earth. Because a man delighted in salt, it was able to become an item of universal desire, just how a very delightful woman is often desired by a multitude of men. But I also want to use it as a pivot to another important aspect of the earthly element. We say something matters when it counts. This word, matters, derives from the word matter for the material, or in other words, the earthly element. How these are related we might see in conventional wisdom. It is, after all, the small things that matter. On romance, it is the small, continuous expressions of affection or disinterest that make or break a relationship. The reason for this being that grand displays can be faked, whilst small, continuous behavior is something that cannot be kept up as a facade. In terms of salvation, even though no saint had theologically harmful teachings, many, if not most saints, were far from being theologians and did, instead, direct their attention to smaller things, things that mattered more to them. This is also why Jordan Peterson's advice of "clean your room, bucko" resonated with so many young men, most of which tended to live in their own heads, as young men often tend to do. In Warfare, Clausewitz relates the concept of friction, which, to paraphrase the Prussian author, is that which differentiates real warfare from warfare on paper. Something which is still true in modern military affairs, where plans are known to change when boots hit the ground. And it is this concept of friction that can further illustrate how the earthly is able to have a purifying effect. The 8 sources of friction Clausewitz identifies, all, except for one, result from a misalignment of the expectation with reality or in disorder relative to reality. By giving 2 potentially opposing orders a room to clash, not dissimilar from how 2 men often come into conflict over a woman, the earthly element gives room for the better ordered to triumph over the more disordered. And, as a final example, I will link in the description a video of how a great idea can be totally crushed by reality in the case of a new trend in construction. The example is illustrative in many ways, and through proper generalization of the dynamics and situations at hand, a lot of additional insight can be derived from it. Although salt can be found in single large chunks or veins, it is typically encountered in the form of many small pieces making up a heap. A heap of salt may then be illustrative to point out the existence of the earthly element as the disconnected multitude. This can be seen too in the prior example of the game of life, where the earthly element was represented by a multitude of singular balls. Their taking form and organizing into structures that seemed organic was the result of the relations that each starting of the simulation instilled into them, or, in other words, the influence of the heavenly element, represented by my own mind, which desired to see certain shapes. To some, this could mean that, if we follow the typology, one man should have many wives, since the wife is earthly relative to the husband. This typology would only work, however, if women needed to come together to be fruitful with their husband, that is, if more than one woman was needed for a pregnancy to take place. Instead, we see the typology play out in the marital relation, where the woman usually takes on a plethora of sentiments and various roles which can sometimes explode into hysteria or being uncollected and/or being all over the place, whilst the husband's role is to remain steadfast and unmoved. It is the heavenly element's role as judge, general, teacher, father and arbiter to foist an order or structure onto these disconnected elements. As a final note, and in preparation for much later videos, I want to give a short remark on Mary's queenship of heaven in contrast to a contending entity that also claims the title and has been known under various names including Ishtar, Venus, Aphrodite, Artimpasa, Astarte, or more recently simply as the goddess. The goddess deity appears in various forms. Sometimes she is purely spiritual, sometimes she is the earth itself. She is usually associated with sex, fertility, and not uncommonly motherhood and divination. Regardless of which form it's taken, she is never human, yet in her respective pantheon or mystery cult often takes on the form of the Queen of Heaven, or sometimes even the true deity. The title Queen of Heaven then often draws people to make parallels to Mary, who holds the title Queen of Heaven in Christianity. This then often leads people to claim that Mary is inspired by a pagan Queen of Heaven. This would mean that Mary is simply a type of the superior deity of the Queen of Heaven. I will outline why I believe the exact opposite to be the case, that the goddess is a disordered type of Mary, in a simple syllogism. Proposition 1. There's a Queen of Heaven which is in heaven. Proposition 2. In heaven, each role is filled by the perfect candidate for that role. Conclusion 1. The Queen of Heaven, which is in heaven, is the perfect candidate for her own role. Proposition 3. Being a female is inherently important to the role as queen. Proposition 4. Being the ultimate of its kind is the qualification of royalty in its perfect sense. Proposition 5. the ultimate female is as feminine as possible. Conclusion 2. The Queen of Heaven is the ultimate female element, which necessitates her being as female as possible. Proposition 6. The most female element has to be the most subjugated and most divided. Proposition 7. Earth, in its wider sense as physical creation, is the most subjugated, below all other things, and most divided, by each atom being able to stand on its own. Conclusion 3. Earth is the most female element. Proposition 8. An entity in heaven cannot be divided and cannot be impersonal. Proposition 9. Earth, physical creation, is divided and impersonal. Conclusion 4. Earth is not an entity in heaven and can therefore not be Queen of Heaven. Side note, we could say that the world is God's virtual wife. He loves her and makes her fruitful, but she doesn't have real being as a singular person. Proposition 10. A physical being is more earthly and therefore more feminine than a non-physical, heavenly one. Conclusion 5 from Proposition 10 and Proposition 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Mary is the more appropriate candidate for the role of Queen of Heaven and therefore the primary holder of the title, because no version of the goddess has a physical body unless that body is Earth itself, in which case Conclusion 4 applies. It should be noted that this line of argumentation only goes so far as to point out that human candidates win out over heavenly or personless candidates in the question of who is the most appropriate holder for the title Queen of Heaven. But since all commonly known versions of the goddess fall under either of those categories, that is enough for us. Without elaborating on it further, I will also, in anticipation of future videos, remark that the rise of the goddess is inherently linked to a modification on point 5, changing it into the ultimate female is as masculine as possible. So, although Earth is the most female of all things, Mary is the ultimate female. She is the Queen of Heaven in opposition to the pagan Queen of Heaven, who is either a personification of creation that lacks real personhood, or a derivative, disordered type of Mary that lacks sufficient femininity.